This presentation is called Religion in American Political Culture. I'm your host, Dr. Peter Wielhouwer, and over the next half hour or so, we're going to be looking at several different aspects of how religion has shaped the way that Americans view politics, and especially the way that religion in the Reformation era, that is, in about the 1500s, played such an important role in developing some central political ideas that had a great impact on the colonization of America, but also in terms of the early political culture that we had. As we move forward, we're going to find that many of the central aspects of American political culture have their roots in the Protestant Reformation of 1500s Europe. That is, our specific way of viewing politics, the way our system is set up, the way Americans understand how to behave in politics, oftentimes have their roots in that conflict that occurred nearly 500 years ago. Understanding these religious roots will help us grasp why the founding generation made some of the political decisions they did. For example, why did we need a system of checks and balances? Why did we need shared powers or separation of powers? Why do we need a constitution at all? In many cases, the reason that they came up with these ideas were that the culture of the day was profoundly influenced from the religious conflicts that had occurred only a couple of hundred years earlier. Of course, it's important to understand that religion is not the only factor that goes into influencing any kind of a culture. Religion is one piece, but there are other things that go on as well. Economic pressures, traditions, and so forth also play a role, but in this case, we're going to focus in only on religion. The main reason we're going to do that is that I think that our culture has lost its sense of consensus, lost its sense of history in terms of the role that religion played in the early years of our republic. In fact, over the last two or three generations, what used to be a broad consensus about religious matters has largely diminished. As a result, we've lost a sense of our history. And so I think it's important for us to discuss the role that faith played in those early centuries. As with any issue related to history, understanding where we are now requires us to have some understanding of where we've come from. If you want to know where you're going, you need to know from what direction you're headed. And so as just a practical matter, I think it's important for us to understand that history, because we don't exist all by ourselves. In fact, Michael Crichton, the author of such political classics as Jurassic Park, wrote, "If you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You're a leaf that doesn't know it's part of a tree." Moreover, and more to the point, we'll find that this particular quote from Franklin Roosevelt has a lot of relevance. He said, remember always, that all of us, and you and I especially, are descended from immigrants and revolutionists. That is, all of us listening to this today, almost all of us here in the United States, are descended from immigrants. None of our fundamental roots are on this continent. Only the Native Americans have that claim. Finally, if we came from Europe, which many of us did, then our ancestors were revolutionists, especially if you're a Protestant. And since about half of all Americans claim to be Protestants, then we have a certain revolutionary pedigree that's important for us to grasp. As we look at the era just prior to the colonization of the New World, it's important for us to have a sense of what the political environment was like in Europe leading up to those decades. For most of the 1500 years prior to colonization of America, the Roman Catholic Church dominated European religion and politics. This began from the end of the Roman Empire in the 300s and the 400s, leading up until the 1300s and the 1400s. In that time period, the Roman Catholic Church sought to legitimize the kings and emperors that were taking power and that would hold power. They sought to establish strategic partnerships in order to influence the way the politics worked. Moreover, kings and emperors sought out these religious connections. They believed that there was a certain connection and legitimacy for their rule by being connected with the church. So there was a synergy, there was a certain partnership there that worked. But by the 1500s, there were certain conflicts that emerged within the Roman Church that eventually led to the separation or the Reformation or the Protestant movement. First of all, because the Roman Church was so involved with politics, there was often political intrigue, and what should have been the Church of God or the church that represented Jesus on earth, instead oftentimes got involved in corruption and got involved in spying and in warfare back and forth. And so people within the church, some political leaders, monks, not political leaders, but religious leaders such as monks, would become very frustrated with the church and the fact that they thought that the church was supposed to be working for God's kingdom here on earth, but instead was spending a lot of time and a lot of money doing politics instead. Moreover, in this time period, in order to finance some of these activities, the church had to raise more money. And one of the ways that they had to raise money, for example, was called selling indulgences. That is, that you could pay off God for your sins by giving cash to the church, and then they would write you a piece of paper called an indulgence that essentially forgave you for whatever sins you were trying to pay off. Well, after a while, this got frustrating too, because it created inequality in the church. The only people who could do this process, who could get engaged in these indulgences, were wealthy people. Poor people were shut out of it. Moreover, there was a real sense of corruption that when a church basically becomes a fundraising entity in order to finance big buildings or in order to finance wars or finance bribes or however it happened to work, there was a certain element there of corruption that really cut against what the general positive character that Christianity and the Bible seemed to be teaching. So within the Roman Catholic Church, there became some individuals who said, this is really wrong and we need to start working against this. This church needs to be reformed. Three other factors helped to grow the resistance and the conflict within the Roman Catholic Church in this time period. The first, in the 1500s, were the ideas of grace and biblical authority. That is, grace is the idea that you don't have to pay off the church, or you don't have to go to a priest, or you don't have to somehow do extra penance in order to receive forgiveness for sins. Instead, individuals receive forgiveness of sins simply by asking for it, simply by going to God themselves through the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And in that process, that's how you got forgiven of your sins, not by being able to pay off the church, not by trying to work off your penance in some physical way. Moreover, the idea of biblical authority what became more important later on. Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, and John Calvin all elevated biblical authority as higher than the authority than the church claimed. So if the church made a statement that appeared to be in conflict with the Bible, who ought to be navigating that? Who ought to be the judge of which statement was correct? Well, this revolutionary group of monks and priests said it has to be the Bible that takes precedence over the Pope or over any papal or religious group. This is the idea of biblical authority. A second factor that emerged was the fact that in the 1400s, the printing press was invented. And by inventing the printing press, what this enabled the church to do was to actually have multiple copies of the Bible printed. Now, ironically, the church didn't want this to happen. The church really opposed the idea of everybody being able to afford a Bible. They were really opposed to that. Moreover, it wasn't just the availability of the Bible, but it was the ability of people to read the Bible in their own language. That's the idea here on this second to last point of the vernacular Bible translations. That is, in Germany, in England, in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, people started translating the Bible from the Latin, from the Greek, even from the Hebrew, into their own languages. What that means is that individuals can then, if they know how to read, they can read the Bible for themselves. When they read what the Bible says, and they hear something different from the ecclesiastical authorities, that is, the priests and the popes, say something that's different from what they themselves can read plainly the Bible, that undermines the authority of the Pope. So you can imagine how the religious establishment would feel about this. They were pretty opposed to the idea that people themselves could look at the Bible and somehow interpret it and challenge the authority of the religious leadership. Moreover, the fact that more and more Bibles were becoming available because of the printing press meant that more and more people had access to this information, and that really undermined the absolute authority of priests and popes' interpretations when they were just simply telling an ignorant population what the Bible said instead of letting people read it for themselves. Finally, in England, King Henry VIII wanted a marriage annulment. The political conflict there was much more crass. He just wanted an annulment for his marriage, and because his wife didn't give him a male heir, and the Pope wouldn't grant it to him. And so the king did what most good kings will do, and most people throwing temper tantrums will do. He said, fine, I'm going to make my own church. So essentially, King Henry claimed all of the Roman Catholic churches that were existing on the island of England in Great Britain, and claimed it for himself. He established himself as the head of the church, and so you had the creation of what's called the English Church, or the Anglican Church. Well, all of these things together basically led to a huge conflict that occurred all within about 50 years of themselves. The first thing is calls for reforms. In 1517, Martin Luther went to the Church of Wittenberg and nailed what's called the 95 Theses on the door there in a call for reforming the way the church was operating. So the people who were following Martin Luther became known as the Reformers, and their movement was called the Reformation. Other groups of people started to protest the way that the church was operating, and so these people were called the Protestants, and that led to Protestantism. Still other groups called for the church to purify itself by getting out of politics altogether. And so these people were called the Puritans. So you had three groups, the Reformers, the Protestants, and the Puritans, all of whom were challenging the authority of the Roman Catholic Church at this time. And then finally in England, the English separation from Rome occurred with Henry VIII basically establishing the Anglican Church. Now, all of this occurred in the 1500s, the 1400s to the 1500s. By the time you get to the late 1500s and early 1600s, England and the Netherlands are starting to colonize the New World. And so when we look at the religious groups that are leaving Europe and coming to the New World, we find these different groups that essentially can set up their own religious cultures, their own religious patterns of activity. And so we see that the different groups settled in different areas. First, in the northern part of the continent, we have New England. These were primarily English Puritans and separatists. They wanted the church to be separate from the state. They wanted the church to be purified and to just be by itself the Church of Jesus Christ and have nothing to do with politics and any of the other corrupt factors that they saw. They predominantly settled in New England, in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, some parts of northern New York. And so these were the groups that dominated there. In the middle Atlantic states, such as southern New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, these areas were primarily settled by the Dutch. They were settled by Swedish and German groups, and there are two dominant religious themes that were going on here, two dominant religious sects, the Reformed sect and the Lutheran sect. So the Reformers sometimes were okay with partnering with the church. The Lutherans usually did partner with the churches. So even if you go to Europe today, you have the Swedish Lutheran Church, you have the German Lutheran Church, and it was often the case that the Lutheran churches did partner with the governments in Europe. In the southern states, really looking at Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and so forth, these colonies were primarily established by English Anglicans. Now, I don't want you to come away with the impression that these three regions were settled by people, all of whom who were seeking religious freedom. We know that the ones who settled in New England, the English Puritans and Separatists, they were primarily interested in religious freedom. To a lesser extent, this was the case in the Middle Atlantic states, the Dutch, the Swedish, the Germans. But then in the South, the English Anglicans, they were not really migrating here for religious reasons. They were primarily after the profit motive. So when you go look at when you go visit the reenactments or the settlements, for example, at Jamestown in southeastern Virginia, the people who settled in Jamestown, they weren't really after religious freedom. They were looking to profit from being in the New World. Finally, in the far South, and this was not really part of what most of us read in our American history, but in the far South, you have Florida, and then over toward the west, you have Texas and California. This was settled by the Spanish, and so these have a very strong Roman Catholic history to them. Finally, once the United States was established, we had 3 major waves of Roman Catholic immigration. So even though the Roman Catholics were a relatively small contingent of people in the original colonies, by the time we get to the 1840s to the 1920s, you have a lot more Roman Catholics that immigrate to the United States. Between the 1830s and the 1850s, the Irish came in. In the 1890s to the early 19-teens, you have the Italians come in. And then in the 19-teens to the 1930s or 40s, you have Eastern Europeans come in. And so all 3 of these groups that are either Roman Catholic or in the case of Eastern Europeans, they're Eastern Orthodox, they tend to have a history that's more Roman Catholic, more traditionalistic, and doesn't have that Protestant flavor to it. So in the United States today, we can identify several major divisions of Christianity. We have Eastern Orthodox churches. These are people that come from churches that are based essentially in Eastern Europe or in Russia or in Greece. They have an ancient Christian tradition. You have the Roman Catholic Church. You have Protestants, and there are 2 main sects of Protestants, Evangelical Protestants and Mainline Protestants. I'm going to give you a brief summary of what they say and how what the difference is between evangelicals and mainlines here for just a moment. But then I have some hidden slides that are in here so that you can, when you're done with this presentation, you can close it out and you can go look at those hidden slides on important theological differences and also some important political differences between these different groups, as well as some other religious groups in American society. So when we look at the religious ideas and the differences between evangelical Protestants and mainline Protestants, first of all, evangelicals tend to hold to a traditionalistic view of the Scripture, that is, of the Bible. That is, in general, they tend to look at the Scriptures and they tend to say, this provides a historical set of information. It provides specific teachings and guidance on how you're supposed to live, some specific principles. It teaches the essentials of the faith, and what it says is, in essence, true, even if there are some difficulties in terms of understanding it, that in general, the Bible means what it says, and it says what it means. Evangelicals, in terms of the way they organize themselves, sometimes there are denominations. So, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention is an evangelical Protestant denomination. Oftentimes, evangelical Protestant churches are non-denominational. That is, they're not connected with any broader hierarchy or regional organization. Mainline Protestants, on the other hand, tend to hold to a more modernistic or liberal view of scriptural interpretation. What that means is that they look at the same scriptures that evangelicals do, but whereas evangelicals will say this is essentially true and a factual historical set of events and principles for living, mainline Protestants will tend to look at the Bible and says this has some general guidelines for how we have to think about ourselves, think about our neighbors, but you can't really take the Scripture literally. You can't really expect that we have information that's accurate in there, and so they tend to be a lot more flexible and less committed to the idea that the Bible itself provides a fixed set of guidelines and information for doing life. Almost all of the mainline Protestant churches are denominational. That is, they're connected into a regional or a national level bureaucracy. When we think about these groups, we may be interested in looking at how they play out today. The United States actually is quite a religiously diverse society. This chart shows us the different kinds of diversity that exists in terms of religious faith. So if we start at let's start in that big orange slice of this pie on the left-hand side where it says Evangelical Protestant. So this is a survey that was done in 2007 and 2008, and I think this is a really good data set. It shows us that Evangelical Protestants make up about 26%, about one-fourth of Americans. The largest groups are Baptists, Pentecostals, and non-denominational Protestants. One of the next largest groups is just down around the area between 6 and 8 o'clock on this circle of mainline Protestants. They make up about 18% of Americans, and these are largely Methodists and Lutherans, but there are also some Presbyterians and Episcopalians in there. The small purple circle there is our historically black denominations. That is, historically speaking, many of the Protestant denominations formed African American denominations during the era of Jim Crow and segregation in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So about 7% of Americans are African Americans who attend historically black denominations. The green circle there, the lower right, represents Roman Catholics. We've got about 24% of Americans who consider themselves to be Roman Catholics. The little red line just above that shows that about 1.7% of Americans are Jewish. We're going to skip the blue segment for just 1 second, and you can look at all those little tiny slices of pie up there between, say, 11 and 12 o'clock, and you'll see that all of those different slices represent all the different kinds of faiths that we have, there are any numbers. So, for example, Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox churches are about 0.6%. Mormons are about 1.7% of Americans. Jehovah's Witnesses, 0.7%. Muslims are about 0.6%. Buddhists, about 0.7%, and so forth. Finally, let's take a look at this blue segment. This may be one of the largest segments in America, and perhaps one of the fastest growing. And these are people who don't have any particular religious affiliation. Now, back 50 years ago, the percentage of people who were in this category was only about 6%. So we have seen a dramatic growth in this group from 6% to 16.1% in the last 40 or 50 years. But what's interesting about this is who actually are these unaffiliated people. When we break things down a little bit more, we find out that we got 1.5% of them are people who call themselves atheists, 2.3% who call themselves agnostics, that is, they don't know, for example, whether God exists. And then you have some people who, about the vast majority of these, who call themselves nothing in particular. What's your religious affiliation? Oh, I don't have any particular religious affiliation. So it doesn't mean that these people aren't religious. It just means that they don't have a religious affiliation. So this group is very interesting, and sometimes some of these groups get a lot more attention than you might expect. For example, Christians spend a lot of time talking about atheists, but atheists are actually quite a small slice of the American religious pie. We can also see that as we look through look at an atlas, for example, that there are broad patterns of religious residency in the United States. So, for example, here's a map of the United States based upon surveys that were done about 15 years ago. That big broad swath there of red that stretches from the East Coast, Virginia, and the Carolinas all the way toward North Texas, that red swath represents counties in which Baptists, that's a evangelical sect, you have Baptists that dominate there. If you look up in the upper Midwest, all those yellow blotches up there, those are Lutherans. If you look over to the west, you have a big pink splotch there in the middle, those are Mormons. So those are areas that are dominated by Mormons. As you look at across the middle part of the country, you see those green flecks. It's kind of a sparse band that stretches from New Jersey all the way headed west, almost all the way out to Colorado. Those are counties that are dominated by Methodists. Now, if you're like me and you're living in Michigan, if you look up at Michigan and you look in the southwestern corner, you'll see on the far west side of the western side of Michigan, you have two counties that are a little bit paler in color. These are teal. Well, these are Reformed counties. So, just for an example, this is basically the Grand Rapids area, where Reformed theology is so important. So you can see here that not only did we have a distinct pattern in terms of where religious groups colonized, but also we have a distinct pattern in terms of where certain religious groups live now. Finally, the rest of the country is dominated by these light blue splotches. The light blue color are Roman Catholics. Now, I don't want you to get the idea that you have this huge swath of Roman Catholics. Remember from the previous slide that only about a quarter of Americans are Roman Catholics. But this tells us that from a political and a social standpoint, you have a lot more Roman Catholics than that dominate certain regions of the country than you might expect. Finally, let's go back now and look at how some of these the aspects of of American political culture, some of them specifically influenced our politics. We have several different points that we're going to make here. First of all, I want to revisit the regional religious differences. Well, the fact that you had the English separatists and Puritans in the north compared with the Anglicans who settled in the south, well, those had different political impacts. What that meant is that there were a lot of free church attitudes in the north. And by free church, we mean churches that a general religious belief that the church should not be connected with the government. Now, this isn't the same thing as saying that people who are religious shouldn't be involved in politics. It's not the same thing as saying people's faith shouldn't influence their political decisions. It's the idea that the church and the state ought to be separated from one another because the church needs to be protected from the power of the government. The overall attitude here, for example, was expressed in a sermon in the 1600s by Roger Williams, who expressed the metaphor of a wall of separation that exists between church and state. And the purpose of the wall was not to protect the church, not to protect the state from the influence of the church, but to protect the church from the influence and the power of the state. That's what's meant by a free church, a church that exists free of the influence of the government. Now, this was true up in the northern colonies. It was less so in the middle and southern colonies. Remember, for example, in the southern colonies, they were settled by the Anglicans, and the Anglicans didn't have any particular beef with having a tied church and government. I mean, the Anglican Church itself, the King of England, the Queen of England, is still the head of the Church of England. So you have these regional religious differences that continued to play for many generations during the colonial period and leading into the American Revolution. From a more substantive standpoint, though, the Reformation ideas were really important for understanding some political ideas that we see in America. One of the most revolutionary concepts of the Reformation, one of the things that set Protestants and the Reformers apart from the Roman Catholic Church, is the principle that individuals have personal access to God. That is, you don't have to go to a priest, you don't have to get the permission of a pope, you don't have to purchase your forgiveness from the church. Instead, if you want access to God, it's really easy. You get that access through Jesus Christ, and you get that access and information about that access on your own through the Bible. You don't have to rely on anybody else for that information. Well, this idea that individuals could actually have this access on their own, that individuals could make these judgments and these discernments without having the Pope's authority or having to go through a priest, that had political consequences. Because what it meant was that if you had that idea in things that really were important from a metaphysical standpoint, such as your eternal salvation or the way that heaven and hell worked, why wouldn't you have those same kinds of principles in terms of the right to make your own choices in other things that are less important, such as politics and the way that you interact with society? So this idea that individuals have personal access to God through Jesus and the Bible actually led pretty directly to the idea that all individuals have rights of conscience. That is, every individual, especially with regard to politics, has the right to believe whatever they want to believe. This even extends into the ideas of religious liberty, that every individual has the right to make their own religious decisions, to worship the way they want to worship or not worship at all. So this idea of you have freedom of conscience, freedom of religious liberty means that this is something that's central to every individual. It's an individual right. Now, let's be clear. This was a general guiding principle, and it wasn't always fairly applied. For example, this idea developed in New England, but it was also New England that kicked some people out of New England for not having the right religious views. So just because they had the general idea of rights of conscience and religious liberty didn't always mean that they fairly applied that on a day-to-day basis. A second doctrine that was really important, or a second set of doctrines, were the doctrines of sin and depravity. The doctrine of sin and depravity essentially says, and there are a lot of disagreements about this, there's a lot of variations on the theme, but the basic idea is that the Reformation taught that every person is by nature fallen, that is, that human beings were created very good by God, but they're no longer very good. They're fallen. They're sinful. And by sinful, that means they're going to do what's in their own best interest to do. They're going to do what's good for them, and setting aside what's good for their neighbor. They're going to be selfish, and they'll be self-centered. Some people go so far as to say that human beings are essentially evil. Others go so far as to say we're just kind of misunderstood and really badly mistaken. The principal idea here, though, is that every person has this as part of their nature. There's nobody that doesn't have this problem. Well, if that's the case, then it's not just me as an individual, as a citizen, as a lowly person in my community with this problem, it's even my political leaders. So the doctrine of sin and depravity said, if we all have the same basic problem before God, then we are religiously equal. We're equal before God. Well, if we're equal before God, then how can we say that some people should be more equal in politics? So this connection was made that we are equal in the eyes of God. We should also be equal politically. Now, of course, this didn't get applied evenly, and it didn't get applied fairly for a long time, and we're still struggling with exactly how to make this work. But the basic principle was there that every person was politically equal. What makes us politically equal is our fundamental approach to understanding human nature, and that is that all people are prone to self-interested behavior. Political leaders especially, that they may go into politics in order to improve the community, but they're human beings, and as human beings they're sinful and self-centered and will do what is in their own best interest to do. So because individuals are equal, everybody, for example, all the men at that time, all the men who owned property, which made them a citizen, they were allowed to vote. That eventually was expanded. But it also meant that you've got sinful people inhabiting government. The people who are holding office are sinful. So in order to manage that situation, you have to set up your political structures that take into account the fact that your political leaders are sinful. And that's why we have separation of powers, checks and balances, and to a certain extent federalism. The political structures were set up to divide power and spread it out among as many people as possible. Major principle that we find in Reformation times is the idea of covenant theology. Covenant theology is the idea that when you study the Bible, over and over and over again, you find examples in there of what are essentially contracts between God and his people. We see this between God and Adam, God and Noah, God and Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, God and Moses, God and David. We have all these covenants, these contracts that exist between God and the people. And then when you start reading about the political environment, that there are contracts that exist between kings and the people. So you have King Saul, who's the first king of Israel. One of the first things that happens is that a covenant or a contract or a constitution is written up describing the relationship and how power is supposed to work. So throughout Scripture, the reformers saw these covenants that emerged as examples of how to manage conflict and relationships in society. So how does this impact the politics of the day? Well, you have social compacts that emerge to help manage the relationships between people and their rulers. The most famous of these, of course, is the Mayflower Compact. And if you recall that in 1620, as the residents of the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, were getting ready to get off the boat, they wrote out a long paragraph that essentially set out the principles of their social agreement with one another, how authority was going to be structured, their personal agreement to live according to their set of rules. They set up a social compact. That's the most famous one, but there are dozens and dozens of these in the colonial period. These social compacts emerged because the people believed that this was a good model, an appropriate model for managing their relationships. Moreover, it enabled them to make sure that they kept their leaders in control. If the rulers knew that there were certain boundaries and parameters for what they could and couldn't do, then if those were in writing, those principles and those boundaries were strengthened. Now, we see these social compacts in all kinds of areas of life. You have social compacts that exist in churches. For example, the idea of a congregational church polity is this idea that church members get together and vote on church policies. Are we going to have stained glass windows or plain windows? Let's vote on it. Are we going to have a new minister? Let's vote on it. Are we going to get carpeting? Let's vote on it. Are we going to try to raise enough money to build a new building? Let's vote on it. So this is all a democratic process that emerges extending out of covenant theology. And finally, of course, constitutions. The United States had a lot of constitutions in that era. When you trace back the roots of the thinking on constitutions, you can trace it back to the Reformers and the Protestant belief that covenants were a central factor, a central organizing concept in managing society. Finally, the last one is Reformation, in terms of the Reformation influence, is jurisdictional theology. Jurisdictional theology says that God, in establishing society and creating the world and organizing the way the people interact with one another, he established certain social institutions, such as the family, the church, civil governments, labor and economic relationships, and he established these social institutions with limited jurisdictions. Now, if you think about a jurisdiction, that is, where does my authority go? If I'm a sheriff, then I have a certain jurisdiction for how far I can do my sheriffing, and I can't go past the county line because my jurisdiction doesn't go beyond the county line. So the same thing happens with these social institutions. The family has institutional jurisdiction around that family. That family member, the father in that family, the mother in that family, doesn't have any authority in anybody else's family. Could you imagine if I said, you know what, I'm doing a pretty good job with my family, I think I ought to go over to your house, and I think I'm going to start telling your father how he ought to start running things, and I'm going to set up my rules and have them run in your house. That's probably not going to go very well. Why? It's because my jurisdiction stops at my family. My jurisdiction does not extend to your family. Well, you have these institutions that God has set up, and they have these limited jurisdictions. You have the family that has its jurisdiction, you have the church that has its jurisdiction. The authority of the church doesn't extend to people who aren't in the church. So the elders and the pastor at my church can't walk across the street to your church and start telling your people what to do. There's no authority to do that because their jurisdiction is limited there. Moreover, in the big picture, Christians don't have the authority to tell non-Christians to behave according to the rules Christians have. So if Christians have a rule, for example, that say you have to give 10% of your income as an offering to the church, they can say that to their own church members because they have authority there, but the church can't go to non-Christians or go to somebody else and start imposing those rules on the people who aren't members of that church. This also applies, though, to the civil government. That when the Reformers looked at the jurisdiction that was listed in the Bible for what the civil government is supposed to be allowed to do, then you have a limit on what its authority is. It has the authority to do certain things. It doesn't have the authority to do other things. So, two parts of this. Jurisdictional theology says God establishes certain institutions with limited jurisdiction. That jurisdiction applies to each of those areas, and the civil government is one of those areas that is specifically intended to be limited by God. We need a civil government. He establishes the civil government specifically, and there's some really clear passages of the Bible on that. But the civil government doesn't have unlimited powers. So, the concept here then emerges in terms of the political impact of jurisdictional theology is specifically on limited government. 3 main points to be made here. First of all, there's a distrust of centralized power. There's an inherent suspicion that if you have a government, for example, that's trying to acquire too much power to itself, there will be a tendency, because the people in the government are sinful and depraved, to extend their jurisdiction beyond what is appropriate in terms of the way God had society set up. Moreover, the more the government tries to do, the more centralized and strong its power is, the more likely it is that the government is going to start giving more and more restrictions to the church. And in fact, when we see strong dictator-like governments throughout history, one of their common elements is that they put in incredible restrictions on what the churches can do. There was less fear of this in terms of, in the founding generation, that religion would influence the government. There was a great deal of concern that the government would try to restrict the churches. And we see a couple of this in 2 examples. First of all, and there was a famous letter that was written by Thomas Jefferson to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut. That's where he used the phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, that later on became misinterpreted by the Supreme Court. But he was writing in response to a letter from them in which they said, we're concerned, Thomas, that if you become president, that you're going to use your authority as the chief magistrate to start dictating what the Church of Jesus Christ ought to be doing and how it ought to run its affairs. That is, they were saying that they were concerned that the president would start to impose his political power on churches. Jefferson wrote back and said, no, that's not my intention at all, because there's a wall of separation between church and state. There was a real fear that the government would try to overpower the church. There was no real fear that religion would be influencing the government like we have today. So that was the Jefferson example. One more example is in the way that politics operated during the founding period and how religion. This is a chart that shows how many people were, how the political writings of the founding era were drawing upon other sources. The main point that I'd like you to draw away from this is that bottom orange part of each column. That represents the percentage of political writings that cite the Bible in each of those decades. So if we look, for example, in that very first column that's labeled 1760s, that is, in the political writings that were public in the 1760s, that 24 means that 24% of the citations in that era were to the Bible. 32% were to Enlightenment authors such as John Locke and Montesquieu and others. And then you had a smattering of other citations after that. But then if you look at the 1770s, and of course the American Revolution starts in 1775, if you look at that decade, 44% of the citations to other writings in political writings were to the Bible. 34% in the 1780s, 29% in the 1790s, 38% between 1800 and 1805. All told, 34% of the times, 34% of the citations that are used in political writings in that era were citations of the Bible. The people who were talking about politics were, yes, they were using other Enlightenment authors, but they were drawing many of their principles and many of their arguments, not just about revolution. That's what you would expect in the 1760s and the 1770s, and maybe to a certain extent in the 1780s. So those first 2 decades, you could be talking about revolution. But when you get to the 1780s, now you're talking about how do you organize the government? How are we going to run our country? And the political writings in this era are dominated by the Bible. This is the statistics. This is not just religious right people claiming that we're a Christian nation. This is showing empirically that when people were writing about politics in that era, and we have copies of those writings still existing, that those writings most often are quoting from the Bible. Well, first, it's important for us to understand that the United States political culture was profoundly influenced by 16th century religious revolutions in Europe, especially the Protestant Reformation in which the Protestant sect of Christianity, the Protestant branch of Christianity, broke off from the Roman Catholic Church. That when we look at several different aspects of what makes American politics unique, that are founding central concepts that we use in our political culture, such as the ideas of constitutionalism, political equality, freedom of conscience, a strong civic culture, separate government and church jurisdictions, limited government. All of these have roots in the theology developed during the 1500s that later influenced the colonies and then later on influenced the American Revolution and the establishment of our Constitution. I want to be clear that Enlightenment thinkers were also relevant. But what's interesting is that some of these later Enlightenment thinkers, when we trace back their ideas, it turns out they were profoundly influenced by these ideas in the Protestant Reformation. So in the 1750s and 60s, you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau writing about the social compact, but he had to know of the theology that was going on because he grew up in a very strong Roman Catholic France. The unalienable rights of John Locke that were adopted by many others in the 1770s, including in the Declaration of Independence. The reason you have unalienable rights from a religious standpoint is because each individual is created in the image of God, and each individual has access to God. That makes them politically equal to one another. So even Enlightenment thinkers are related and have themes that emerge coming out of the Reformation. So let me conclude by saying that not every aspect of American political culture was religious in nature. But I think it's important for us to look back on our history and understand why some important ideas do extend out of religious beliefs and out of religious conflicts that made Protestantism a dominant force in world history, but also that focused on the liberty of individuals and the role of limited government and the way that works out in a distinctly American way. Thank you very much.